If you're on a spiritual path, you've probably heard this advice countless times. Kill your ego, transcend the ego, become egoless. I used to chase this goal relentlessly, but then I discovered something that stopped me in my tracks. Both Alan Watts and Carl Jung revealed that this very attempt to destroy the ego might be the source of our deepest suffering. Today we'll explore a radically different perspective, one that's backed by both ancient wisdom and modern psychology. I'll share with you why understanding your ego, rather than fighting it, might be the key to genuine spiritual growth. And by the end of this video, you'll have practical tools to transform your relationship with your ego and deepen your spiritual journey. You see, these great minds understood something fascinating. The very act of trying to kill your ego is actually your ego at work. Think about that for a moment. Who exactly is trying to kill what? It's like trying to bite your own teeth, as Alan Watts would say. The ego isn't some foreign entity that invaded you. It's not your enemy. It's actually a natural part of human consciousness, a tool that helps us navigate this world. Think of it like learning to dance. You need both structure and flexibility. The ego provides that structure, but problems arise when we become too rigid or try to eliminate the structure entirely. In today's spiritual circles, we see this conflict everywhere. Scroll through social media, and you'll find countless posts about transcending the ego, killing the ego, or becoming egoless. People share their profound spiritual experiences, competing to appear the most enlightened, not realizing that this very competition is the ego at play in spiritual clothing. You could also call it the spiritual ego. Alan Watts, one of the most influential philosophers of the 20th century, observed this irony with remarkable clarity. He noticed how the people most concerned with killing their ego often display the most spiritual pride. "I'm so humble," they might say, not realizing the contradiction. Or they might compete about who's more egoless. He saw how we often create a spiritual version of materialism. Instead of collecting things, we collect spiritual experiences. Instead of comparing cars, we compare how egoless we are. What Watts understood was that the ego is like a game we're playing. The problem isn't that we're playing, it's that we've forgotten we're playing. It's like an actor who's forgotten they're in a play and become completely identified with their role. The solution isn't to stop acting, it's to remember that you're acting. This understanding was further deepened by Carl Jung, one of the founders of modern psychology. Through his decades of clinical work with patients, Jung observed something that many spiritual traditions had overlooked. He saw that trying to transcend the ego prematurely was like trying to build a house from the roof down. It simply doesn't work, and the attempt often leads to psychological fragmentation rather than genuine growth. In his clinical practice, Jung worked with many spiritual seekers who had tried to eliminate their ego. What he found was striking. The harder they tried to kill their ego, the more it would emerge in unexpected and often problematic ways. Like water finding its way through cracks, the suppressed ego would surface as spiritual pride, judgmental behavior, or what he called inflation, a state where people believed they had transcended the ego while actually being more entangled in it than ever. Let's look at how this plays out in modern spiritual communities. You might have met someone who claims to be beyond ego, yet becomes defensive at the slightest criticism, or someone who's transcended materialism but constantly talks about their expensive spiritual retreats. This isn't hypocrisy, it's what Jung called compensation, where the suppressed ego finds indirect ways to express itself. The key insight that emerged from Jung's work was revolutionary. The ego isn't something to be destroyed, but something to be integrated. Think of it like learning to work with a powerful horse. The goal isn't to break the horse's spirit or to let it run wild. It's to develop a partnership based on mutual understanding. Sometimes you need to hold the reins firmly, sometimes you need to loosen your grip, but you never try to eliminate the horse altogether. This is where many spiritual seekers fall into what we call spiritual bypassing. They try to jump straight to enlightenment without doing the necessary groundwork. It's like trying to reach the top of a building by ignoring all the middle floors. You might think you're making progress, but you're actually creating instability. Here's what spiritual bypassing often looks like in practice. Denying negative emotions because they're not spiritual. Using meditation to avoid dealing with real issues. Pretending to be above normal human experiences. Judging others for having ego while denying your own. Jung found this pattern repeatedly in his practice. One particularly memorable case involved a spiritual teacher who prided himself on having transcended ego. Yet in therapy, it became clear that this supposed transcendence was actually a sophisticated form of avoidance. His egolessness was itself an ego strategy, a way to feel superior while avoiding genuine self-confrontation. This brings us to a crucial understanding about the ego that both Watts and Jung emphasized. The ego isn't just some psychological construct, it's a fundamental tool for human experience. Just as your body needs a skin barrier to interact with the physical world, your consciousness needs an ego to interact with the social and psychological world. Think about martial arts masters. They don't aim to destroy their ego. They learn to use it skillfully. In fact, a strong, healthy ego is essential for maintaining boundaries, pursuing goals, and engaging with the world effectively. The key is developing what we might call ego flexibility, knowing when to assert and when to yield, when to stand firm and when to let go. So what does healthy ego integration actually look like? It's like being a skilled dancer. You need both structure and fluidity. Sometimes you lead, sometimes you follow, sometimes you maintain your form, sometimes you improvise. The art is in knowing when to do which. Here are some signs of healthy ego integration. You can acknowledge your achievements without becoming inflated. You can receive criticism without being devastated. You can hold opinions while remaining open to other perspectives. You can care about your appearance without being obsessed. You can pursue goals without your whole identity depending on them. In his later years, Jung documented numerous cases of individuals who had successfully integrated their ego. One notable example was a businessman who had initially sought therapy for spiritual crises. Through understanding and working with his ego rather than against it, he developed what Jung called a conscious ego, one that could engage fully with life while maintaining spiritual awareness. This understanding transforms how we approach personal growth. Instead of waging an endless war against our ego, we can develop a more nuanced relationship with it. It's like learning to play a complex instrument. Sometimes you need precise control, sometimes you need to let go and let the music flow through you. Have you ever noticed how after a spiritual retreat or deep meditation, you might feel very peaceful and egoless, but then someone challenges your beliefs and suddenly all that spiritual progress seems to vanish? This is because we often mistake temporary states for true transformation. Real change isn't about achieving some permanent state of egolessness. It's about developing a new relationship with our ego. There's a beautiful teaching from the Zen tradition that aligns perfectly with what both Watts and Jung discovered. They talk about the difference between trying to silence the mind and letting the mind settle naturally. It's like the difference between forcing water to be still by pushing it down versus allowing it to become still on its own. The same principle applies to our relationship with ego. And this brings us to something really practical. How do we actually work with our ego in challenging situations? Let's say you're dealing with criticism or feeling inferior to others or caught in comparison. These are prime situations where the ego gets activated. Here's a three-step approach that combines the wisdom of both Watts and Jung. First, recognition. Notice when your ego is activated. Learn its patterns, its triggers, its favorite stories. This isn't about judging it, just becoming familiar with how it operates in your life. Remember, if you see, you become free. Second, relationship. Instead of immediately trying to transcend or fix the ego's reaction, get curious about it. What is it trying to protect? What is it afraid of? This is where Jung's insight about integration becomes practical. Third, relaxation. As you develop this understanding, you'll find moments where you can naturally relax your ego's grip without trying to destroy it. It's like learning when to hold tight and when to hold loose. Remember, this journey isn't about reaching some perfect state of egolessness. It's about developing a wiser, more compassionate relationship with all parts of yourself. As Jung would say, the goal is wholeness, not perfection. I'd love to hear from you. What resonates most with this perspective? Have you experienced this paradox in your own spiritual journey? Share your insights in the comments below.